playoff semifinals. The granddaddy of them all is our host, and we will eat steak. Let them eat steak. This is the College Game Day Podcast for Friday, December 29th. Rece Davis, Pete Thamel, Steve Coughlin, better known as Stanford Steve, sitting in this immaculate museum at the Rose Bowl. It's the original Rose Bowl locker room where Newt Rockne fired up the troops. I know it's been a minute, Steve, since you played in the Rose Bowl, but this is not the Stanford locker room, was it?
No. We were over in the other end. So the locker rooms are still the same. It's funny, or it's not funny, but I really hit me. We were just talking about the Bama-Alabama or Bama-Texas national championship when Colt McCoy gets hurt. And they had the camera of him in that tunnel. That was our locker room. I'm like, oh man, that's not a good omen if he's in that one coming out that a loser. But this is spectacular.
Yeah, no waterfalls in the locker room in 1922 when this was built. I can confirm.
You look and you see the quotes over our shoulder if you're watching on YouTube, and you should be. Keith Jackson, who was the voice of college football for over half a century, called it the Mecca, the mansion at the end of the yellow brick road. For everybody who's a college football fan, this is where you want to come. And it's really true. The stadium itself probably doesn't have all of the bells and whistles of some of the more modern stadiums, but there's no grander setting in sports. And as we get ready for the semifinal game between two of the biggest brands in sports, the winningest program, the second winningest program in the history of college football, the all-time leader in national championships, Alabama against Michigan, it's sort of fitting that as we close out this era of college football that you have these two big brands on this stage. And Michigan played in the first ever Rose Bowl in 1902.
I just think of everybody calls helmet games, like these helmets on this field in this setting. Weather looks like it's going to be good. I also did play in the only Rose Bowl I felt like that rained. Everybody talks about the end of the third quarter, sun setting over the mountain. Yeah. There was no sun that day. We were waiting for it to come out. We needed something. No, it did the brands, the names, the head coaches, everything. Finally, in the last year of the playoff, we get it in this place, and we got to get there.
I can't wait, and I really think we're going to dive into the X's and O's and everything, but I think we'll look back at one of these games as like the talent on the field. When you look at the high-end talent, Michigan has at defensive back. When you look at what Alabama has at defensive back and on the edge, when you look at some of the skill guys, Colson Loveland is a guy who I think is going to be a 10-year – like there's just – and they're two styles that don't really contrast. They sort of blend together, and it makes it, I think, a really tricky game to predict in a lot of ways because I don't think this is going to be some old-fashioned shootout like we saw Vince Young and Reggie Bush and Matt Leinart and those guys have here in 06. I think this is going to be something Keith Jackson would enjoy, a little bit more of a tussle in the trenches.
And that is really one of the interesting matchups. And to dive right in, Michigan without Zach Zenter, who arguably their best offensive lineman. Alabama's rush defense is not up to the standard of Saban's national championship teams at Alabama. But when they've gone heavier personnel, they've been better. And one might expect that you might see a little heavier personnel in the front seven and not as much nickel from Alabama. They've been nickel just about all year.
Well, I think the first thing, I did a couple things on ESPN.com this week where I broke down, talking to opposing coaches, the games, and the most glaring, I think, area where Michigan has to worry about, and there's certainly areas Alabama has to worry about up front too in protecting the quarterback. But when you dial into Michigan and how they played against Iowa in the Big Ten title game, Zinter leaves at right guard, and then obviously they move Trente Jones into right tackle, and right tackle Carson Barnhart kicks into guard. Barnhart had been the weak link of that offensive line. Penn State exposed them. We obviously saw the famous 32 straight runs by Michigan against Penn State. A lot of that was out of, we don't want to strip sack to lose us the game. And so some of that was by necessity. In a lot of ways, that accentuated Michigan's reputation as this power run team that had 2 straight Joe Moore Award winners, but it also glossed over a weakness, whereas we are not good at blocking the edge. And that's where Alabama obviously has the biggest strength. Is Dallas Turner is probably the best player in this football game. And he does not come off that right side. So when you talk to the coaches in the Big Ten who watched the Big Ten title game, they really thought the right side and really the center are going to be the areas that Michigan has to cover up the most. Now, Turner is going to come off the other side. He's not going to line up, or at least traditionally this season, he has not lined up much, and most of his production has come off the opposite edge. But also, if they have to focus on Turner, it could leave that right side a little bit more exposed. So I think if there's one matchup that I think really stands out in this game, Rece, it's how Michigan's recalibrated offensive line adjusts without its best player.
And in addition to that, it's not just Turner. I mean, Chris Braswell on the other side, too, gives them an opportunity to exploit that if they can. And then there's the whole aspect, Steve, of J.J. McCarthy, who midseason, I've brought this up a few times, Nebraska game, there were 3 throws. One of them just it wasn't a touchdown or anything that I was like, holy cow, boy, is that an NFL throw? Like big-time throws. Now, you've got 1 touchdown pass in the last 5 games. I think he hasn't been over 150 yards since the Purdue game. And you wonder if the time off has allowed him to get a little healthier or if there's something else. I mean, there's been talk of an ankle injury. Maybe there's something else. But they haven't been terribly effective in the passing game, not nearly as effective as they were earlier. Some point to Connor Stallions, some point to better defenses that they've played. Yeah. And all of these things could have played a role. And he could also be banged up, and he might be a little bit healthier than he's been in a few weeks.
I think you touched on a multitude of things that factored into that. You mentioned not throwing the ball effectively. They haven't had to, right? I mean, the schedule speaks for itself. The goal was to get back to this point after how bad of a loss and the taste in their mouth was after that game. And you go back and watch that game, and it's McCarthy. That was a big problem in that game. 2 pick sixes. They could never get over the hump. The defense, just got elongated with that style that TCU plays, and they were gassed. When they needed to stop, they couldn't get in the fourth quarter. So I look at McCarthy on this stage as the biggest factor in the game. I'm sure we'll talk Alabama's offense against Michigan's defense, but when you look at that, you talked about 1.9 rushing yards per rush in the Big Ten title game against Iowa. And Iowa's a team that is not going to hide what they're doing. You basically know, but they're just so damn stubborn in what they do. And Michigan, I thought, even proved more point how stubborn they are. I mean, you could see it. Let's get a win. Let's get out of here. And we know we're nicked up, as you pointed out, Rece. And now they're here. So the time off, you mentioned getting healthy. I also look at Michigan coming in now is they're going to have to throw the ball consistently to win this game. They have to. And they haven't done it all year because they haven't had to. But with Harbaugh and Schroeder and those guys, the time off and Jim's always been a great job of making runs look like passes, making passes look like runs. And what do you do with that? You get tight ends sneaking out into the flat. You get them running down the middle of the field if the safeties' eyes are watching the backfield. So I expect Michigan to come out with a really good game plan. Both offensive coordinators have been known to be stubborn. So when you talk about high scoring, low scoring, I could see, being a test of will. So I look at Alabama, though, as you mentioned, not having those guys that they've had in the past with the great run, but they have effective guys. They got guys at linebacker that look like Alabama linebackers from old. They got a true freshman in the secondary. Is he going to get got a couple times? Maybe. But how big of a factor will that be? Will it be a touchdown or will it be a third down conversion? So there's a lot of factors in, but I look at Alabama's defensive line too, and I think a general fan would be like, oh, Alabama has more depth on the defensive line. They don't. Michigan plays way more guys on the defensive line. I think that's going to be a factor for them to hang in this game. And when you look at Alabama, I believe they have 3 guys on the defensive line that played over 500 snaps.
Wow.
And Michigan doesn't have one that played 300.
That's a great stat.
When you think about the general sense of the SEC school coming to play a Big Ten, Michigan has the advantage on the defensive line, and they need that to come through for them to be in this game.
Explosive plays, too. Michigan hasn't been able to generate the same number that they did just a year ago. And even though Alabama might not be quite what it's been in terms of depth and physical nature up front, I do still have a hard time thinking that Michigan is going to be able to get out of this game without getting some chunk plays, some significant ones, and probably home run touchdown plays.
So Steve brought up a great point about the tight ends. Now, he is defiantly biased towards his old position, but I don't think there's a better tight end duo in the country than Michigan's 2 tight ends, Colson Loveland and Barner. You may be able to think of a better duo.
I'll let you go.
Okay. All right. No.
I'm not going to shoot you down. It's your opinion.
Yeah.
We got it all.
I think Loveland is one of the 3 top tight ends for the 25 draft, and Barner, who's sort of the other tight end, is Mel Kiper has him in his top 10 for this draft. So he's probably a late round draft pick. So I really feel like that's an area that Michigan needs to exploit. And I felt like without Colson Loveland, Michigan doesn't beat Ohio State. It felt like every key third down conversion, he's twisting his body, contorting, finding space to do that. Those 2 tight ends give Michigan, I think, their greatest advantage because you can go 12 personnel, but you can and run the ball if they're small. Like you said, they've been more effective in heavier run packages. Well, can those heavier run packages guard those 2 tight ends?
Right.
I think that's the conflict that Kevin Steele and Nick Saban are going to have to face in this is, okay, if we're going to go big, we have I mean, one of the memories of the Ohio State-Michigan game 2 years ago was Loveland running down the seam by himself, basically. And so it's going to be a really interesting chess match to how they go. But if Michigan wins this game, I feel like those guys are both going to have 4 or 5 catches, and one of them's going to have a touchdown. They need production there because I don't have faith in Michigan's receivers creating separation from Alabama's defensive backs.
Right. Alabama's got 2 All-American corners. I think Michigan has the best corner in the game, Will Johnson. But, I mean, Kool-Aid McKinstry and Terrion Arnold, both first-team AP All-Americans. The tight end point is a great one. I know it's probably the most mentioned game of the season because everybody harkens back to Alabama, Texas, whether, that's where Alabama changed. It's where Texas proved itself. Big numbers for tight end in that game. Ja'Tavion Sanders.
Yes.
Great
point,
big numbers for the tight end. It's been a long time ago.
Remember that 4th down conversion? It was right in front of us on the field. Yeah.
And so, that's something that they'll have to deal with, I think, for sure.
The one thing about Michigan, too, with a Harbaugh offense going back to his Stanford days, it's amazing, when he has the Zach Ertz and the Kobe Fleeners about, look at them, they split their tight ends out. But what's effective is when they come down, and he does a great job of teaching, they're more effective in the pass game when they're inside.
Interesting.
In the box. So that's the one thing. I mean, now with all this motion and split zone and whether you got, I'm going to run at you and I'm going to block you 3 times and then I sneak out. That's what I'm talking about, making the runs look like passes. That's what Michigan's got to pride themselves on to be effective. And third down, and what McCarthy held, he can use his legs. Yeah. He's going to have to do that just to get first downs. Yes. If the throw's not there and he could do it, I expect him to play smart football. I think it's a big spot for McCarthy.
Another interesting thing about this game is the lack of success that Harbaugh has had in the postseason, the lack of success that Michigan has had historically in the postseason and in the Rose Bowl specifically, and the fact that a lot of the players have talked about that they changed up preparation a little bit. It wasn't wide open all the time. They mixed in a few more walkthrough days, a few more times to let them put a little more emphasis, as it were, on recovery. And whether that helps Michigan, maybe not so much because they were worn out. I think that's a cliche sometimes. But sometimes when something's not working, if you just change the approach, you make everybody think it's going to work better. And there's maybe a little more, they feel as if they're fresher, whether they really are or not. Maybe they are, but maybe they just think they are, which is just as important.
I think one tweak we're going to see from both play callers in this game is that they are going to be a lot more quarterback-designed runs. I think when you go back and look at playoff games, look at Trevor Lawrence in that Ohio State games in years past, there's less concern for injury with not a lot of tomorrows left, right? So I really feel like Hurts, if you talk to the coaches who played Alabama, they really built in some nice QB run stuff that wasn't really in the package earlier in the year for them. Tommy Rece has been known to run the quarterback in the postseason a little bit more if you look back at his history with Ian Book at Notre Dame. And I think the same thing for McCarthy. I think they acknowledging the weaknesses up front, some of that is going to have to come with creating yards through a QB run game because you don't like your hats on their hats. So I really feel like both these quarterbacks with their legs are going to be a huge factor, and that's going to be a big variable of how you slow that down.
And Steve, Jalen Milroe is the second fastest guy on Alabama's team, not just on the whole team.
Yeah.
And he has learned better when to run and how to create because he took all of those sacks early because he wanted to stay in the pocket and make the pass, and then sometimes he would wait too late and he'd get caught. He's been really good over the last 5 or 6 games at knowing when to go, and it's something Tommy Rece talked about early on in finding those design quarterback runs is getting Jalen comfortable enough to know when to go, when it's okay to pick up 7 and get out of bounds and take the first down. And then, he can, as we saw against LSU, saw against Auburn in big spots off scrambles. It doesn't have to be designed runs. And look, let's be candid about it. Maybe Michigan can still tackle him. They're athletic enough. It's not, but they haven't played anybody like him in terms of being a runner.
No, and when I go back and I watch every Michigan game, the best quarterback they played against, I believe, is Taulia Tagovailoa. Like I honestly believe that. And again, it goes back to their schedule. And again, it's not Michigan's fault. You can only play who's on your schedule. But that's like the preparation. They put Donovan Edwards at quarterback scout team. Like I don't know how you prepare for an athlete like that. And when you talked about the struggles of Milroe early on, there's a multitude of things I think that people overlook. And people didn't know what to do because at the beginning of the year, the brand name teams, Alabama, Ohio State, other teams, they always had a quarterback with experience. And you mentioned knowing when to run. It takes time. It really does. And the problem was he played bad in that early game against Texas when their quarterback played great and they go in and get the win. And how do you overcome that? It's just hard work and reps, man. And people, fan bases, I think, have gotten so spoiled with how good that position has been for them because when you go back and you want to look at who's been in the playoff, look at that position. The great quarterbacks have been there. So I think it's just been a learning process, but time. And also that offensive line. It's not a true freshman left tackle. And with that, knowing when to run with Milroe, but also, hey, we could do a little bit more now. We feel better about our guys up front. Maybe we could help them with a tight end. Let's take a tight end out. Let's bring them in. All that different stuff, that's where those offense coordinators make their money, and it's really, really been a cool thing to watch like that offense evolve, from going back and watching. I mean, that South Florida game, I just take it out. But I do because you don't get anything out of it. Right. They definitely learned something from it.
Yes.
So I can't wait to see how that factors out.
Regardless of what happens in this semifinal game, where does this rank among Saban's coaching jobs at Alabama?
Whew, man, he's had some good ones. I think the thing that I'll remember about this coaching job was just how unflinching he was throughout it, because there was a lot of noise coming out of that Texas game. You lose to the, you now, after beating all his former assistants, now all of a sudden he's on a losing streak to his former assistants. And there was, and there will, from this point on in Nick Saban's career, whether he coaches 5 more weeks or 5 more years, every end of season will come with, is this the dawn of Saban? And every loss will come with, is this the decline of Saban? It's just, it's the monster he's created, right? And that's the highest compliment to him. But I feel like they were never untalented, but the way college football works now, you're just going to have more untested guys at a place like Alabama. You mentioned the offensive line. They're still 115th in the country in sacks allowed.
Yeah.
It's 3.3 a game. Now, Michigan doesn't have the edge guys maybe to exploit it like some of the SEC folks do. They certainly have the dudes inside.
Yeah.
I actually wrote today that Michigan, it's antithetical to the Big Ten SEC argument, but Michigan has the better interior D lineman. I don't even know if it's close, to be honest with you, from high-end stuff. Now, Alabama has a lot of them. And they're big, and they maybe wear them down. But I just think Saban knew he had a good team, and he was just very deliberate. And I do think the South Florida game was the turning point because it made the team realize this is what we have to do.
Yeah.
It eliminated all ambiguity in quite an awful way, right? Because they almost got more criticism for the South Florida game than they did for losing to Texas.
And that was my main thing. They won.
Yeah.
It didn't mean anything. You're coming off again, a loss. You get a win and you learn from it, and that's why it's the best to me, because of the unknown at the quarterback position. And you also think about it, they really didn't have a name at running back.
Yeah.
I mean,
they still
whatever, Mark Ingram, Derrick Henry, Eddie Lacy, all those guys. There wasn't one of those guys where you could say, all right, you know what, we're going to turn around and hand it to him. So it's been remarkable. I do think he let his coaches coach also, but you think about that idea of a quarterback not playing, a running back not there, and then a safety and a true freshman. It all worked out, and it's a huge credit to them plowing through that and getting the job done.
And also
what do you think his best job before this is, Rece? You're a resident Alabama expert. Or what's comparable?
I mean, it's really. I think probably the easy answer is 15 because they lost an early game. They started a guy quarterback. There was disagreement, shall we say, on the staff as to who the quarterback should be. So there are some parallels to that 2015 team that Jake Coker ended up sort of taking over and being the alpha, as Kirk likes to say, and sort of the tough guy. Milroe did that in a different way, but he's done some of that. So I would say, because when we say best coaching job, it's always about doing something that's not expected.
Sure.
It's a pretty darn good coaching job when you are expected to win and you still do. So he's done, a lot of those are good too.
Even though they lost an SEC title game, I go back to, what was that, 08 with JPW. That's when, it went from, all right, we think they're going to, all right, they're there. Yeah. They're there, and you know what's coming next year. Like that was the one where I thought it could happen because of, you get that second year and you have, you've got more guys of your guys in those places. But I always go back to that one because that one, you could see the fearlessness they played with. And I'm like, this thing's going to be an animal coming forward. You know it coming.
Jim Harbaugh is a great coach, regardless of what happens. He's been to the Super Bowl. 3 straight Big Ten titles outright. Hasn't been done in the long and illustrious history of Michigan football. He's a great coach. Okay, caveat's been offered. What's at stake in your judgment for him and Michigan in this game in terms of perception of them as a national power? Because there's going to be a little more turnover next year on this roster maybe than they've had. They had some last year too, obviously. But there will be changes. There's a question about whether he is going to entertain the NFL again. All of those things.
I think there's much of a question.
Yeah, okay. Well, he's going to entertain it. I was trying to be diplomatic on a couple of days before he plays to go to the national championship game, Pete. Just kidding. But what's his you know him really well from his days at Stanford and since then. What's his stake for him in terms of perception?
I think when you factor in all that's happened this year, and I think it's unprecedented, being how many games
he's missed 6 games.
Wasn't on the sidelines for. I think it's a monster because I actually was impressed. I thought they were going to get blown out when they played in the Citrus Bowl a couple of years ago, and they played pretty well. Mac made a bunch of throws in the second half, or maybe it was the late second quarter, and I thought he took that as a big step because he was like, this is what he wants to be considered the best, and now you have the stage. And I go back to last year and how disappointing that loss was.
It was a bad loss.
It was a bad loss.
And when you say that, you feel like you're bashing TCU, and I don't mean
no,
it that
not
way.
at all. No,
Michigan,
they took advantage of the opportunities that were given to them, and there were
Yeah.
more than there should have been. And it's based off of what Michigan, because you go back to the year prior, that game was over after the first series, and they knew they did it. But like, what was the only way to go back before that? People wanted him out. Couldn't beat Ohio State, and wasn't impressive in doing that. So I think it's huge for him personally being on this stage. And the other thing, they were a favorite last year. We touched on that, how that went. But you're the favorite against Alabama. Like you can't come out here and score 10 points and lose. Like you have to. You have to play to your advantages, and that's what a good coaching staff does. I believe they have a really good coaching staff. So I expect them to play well. I just don't think they're that well is good enough to beat Alabama. That's where I keep coming back to, knowing what Alabama brings to the table. I think I don't like the matchup for Michigan.
I think it all depends on mistakes. Alabama has limited them in the second half of the season, but everybody remembers the Gravedigger play in the 4th and 31, and Pete knows from the preseason podcast. He asked me who's going to start at quarterback for Alabama this year. I said Jalen Milroe. So I've really been a fan of his talent. But even in the 12th game of the season, he threw a couple of passes like 3-4 yards past the line of scrimmage, and drew penalties for them. Just things like that. The snap issues that they've had. They've cleaned up some of the penalty things in the latter part of the season, which also speaks to their improvement. But things like that will cost them against Michigan on New Year's Day.
Well, I think that's why this is going to be a low-scoring game. I had a coach in the Big Ten tell me a really interesting point. He said, you can't get bored playing Michigan because they're going to shorten the game, and you can't get anxious. You can't do it in your offensive play calling. You can't do it in your defensive play calling. You have to I called it in my article this week, a sound-off. You have 2 very sound teams whose coaches are defined by being sound. They're NFL. They're going to do what they do best. They're going to take away what you do best, all those things. So there's going to be a little bit of a stare-down to who makes that critical mistake. And let's face it, Jalen Milroe has made some of those early in the year, and that's what sort of helped Alabama, recast themselves and redefine themselves. And then does Michigan's vulnerabilities up front lead to one of those mistakes because of the pressure they could go? So I feel like it will be a conservatively called game because I think aggression these coaches are going to fear is going to work against them.
I look at what Alabama did in that SEC championship game also. They did not start that game well. And then you go back and you look, we're sitting there at the end of the fourth quarter. They got McKinstry in sweatpants. He's on the sideline. And Dallas Turner
doesn't play.
No, and Dallas Turner's playing on one leg. And to be able to power through us. And I go back to the beginning of the game and seeing Booker, the offensive guard, pregame, and he's just screaming, going into the tunnel, they ain't cut like us. They ain't cut like us. And I'm telling you, that was one of the scariest things I've ever seen. Like, I'm walking this way. I'm like, I'm going to stop and let him go up to the tunnel.
You aren't cut like him either?
I think the world of that kid. I've known him for a long time. And I just said, and then to see how that game starts and be able to just battle through and line up and put your hand down and just do it through you're doing well because you're not giving in. And it's a great point by you. I expect both these teams, no one's going to be fear of either team. There are going to be some serious collisions in this game. There's going to be some serious stalemates at the line of scrimmage, and who makes the most plays obviously is going to be the difference. But mistakes is huge. You can't put yourself in a position where you're going to make that mistake. That's going to be too costly.
Not to take away from Alabama's win, but that's one of the reasons why winning a bunch of games in a row is difficult. Georgia won 29 in a row, and things start piling up. So with Georgia's loss, the nation's longest winning streak now belongs to Washington. They've won 20 in a row and played Texas in the Sugar Bowl, and what feels like it's going to be a very different style of game from what we're going to see here in Pasadena. And some of the matchups there are pretty compelling too. You look at the great success that Washington has had throwing downfield, specifically outside the numbers, which is the place where Texas is vulnerable. Washington wins the Joe Moore Award for the nation's best offensive line, and yet you've got two absolute studs in the middle of Texas defensive line, Tavondre Sweat and Byron Murphy, who might wreck that entire offense right up the middle by moving Penix off his spot. It almost feels like that if he can have time to throw outside, you'll like Washington's advantage. But if not, I feel like Texas could control the game.
A couple things on that. I look at what Washington did in the Pac-12 title game. They came out throwing the football, and Oregon did not know what to do. So now you got to take guys out. And then look at the second half. Oregon took all the momentum back, took the lead, and what did they do to get back the lead back? They ran the ball with Dylan Johnson in that offensive line. And a couple things. With that defensive line, Coach DeBoer knows that Texas has the advantage there. What do you do to offset that? They're great at misdirection, getting out of pocket, half rolls with Penix. And you mentioned Texas is going to they're not true freshmen anymore, but they still are, in the program. But you start a true freshman at safety and a true freshman at corner against those NFL receivers for Washington. That's why I like Washington in this game.
If they're not freshmen anymore, then what are the super seniors?
Oh, that's a whole different podcast. That's a whole.
If the freshmen are sophomores and the sophomores are now juniors, and the juniors are seniors, and the seniors are grad students. What are the grad students?
They're not paying for extra for rental cars anymore.
What do you think? You've done a breakdown on this. Talked to some opposing coaches. Where does this game swing?
So it's interesting. I do think the receiver – Texas' secondary has been its biggest vulnerability all year. They've had guys injured. They've circled guys in. Young players have emerged. But it's been a little bit tinfoil and a paper clip and some glue. Like, it just hasn't been the most – that's probably their weakest unit out there. So I do think the receiver point is great, and certainly Kalen DeBoer is going to attack that. But I do think Steve made a good point about Dylan Johnson. From week 9 on – only Ollie Gordon has gained more yards than him in all of college football. And he's looked dominant at times. And one of the opposing teams who played Texas this year one of the OCs made a great point to me. He said, we just said we are not going to run between the tackles. We're not going to run the ball just to run the ball. You know the whole thing, you got to establish. He said, we ran the ball 0 times because we knew our dudes couldn't handle it. Now, I know Washington won the Joe Moore Award. Their strength is at tackle. It is not interior, especially the center's a little light. So I feel like we're going to see a lot of creative run games, mid-zone, outside zone, and that is going to set things up for Washington. I don't think they're just going to run the Oklahoma drill up the middle just in order to do it. Now, will we see Dillon Johnson have to block more? He's a good pass protector. He's not great, but will we see him stay in and protect the middle a little bit and do that? Usually, those guys help on the edge, not as much on the interior.
That doesn't sound like fun for Dillon.
No, it doesn't sound like fun for Dillon. Yeah,
you could also one of those 3 tight ends in the backfield and say, all right, we're throwing the ball right here.
Yes,
but now you got to come get us.
Yes, and I think Odunze and McMillan in the Pac-12 title game, the coaches who watched it just said they move him around so much, he makes such a difference. And they really didn't have that element. In a lot of ways, McMillan's injury made them go re-find a new identity on offense. And Dillon Johnson emerged as part of that. They had that awful game against Arizona State where they didn't pee a drop the whole game on offense. And they went back and give them credit, right? Kalen DeBoer and Ryan Grubb's roots are in the NAIA. When you're not working with, toys like Rome Odunze, who is, one of the best receivers that college football's seen in a long time. And they've found different ways to move the ball, and now all of a sudden they're back at full strength, having acquired all this different identity along the way.
I look at Washington, and just as far as knowing yourself, right, knowing your identity, and you touched on with the McMillan injury. I thought they ran a gauntlet at the end. I mean, I get it. SC was not a great football team this year, but still have to go there and outscore. And they didn't throw the ball to outscore them. They ran the ball. I mean, ran for 240, right? And then you got to come home and you got to play Utah. Off of that game, then you go to Corvallis in the pouring rain. You still win the game because of throws you made. You get by with a win against your rival in a no-win situation, and then you win a game as a double-digit underdog against a team that everyone thought was going to beat you. That's some damn impressive stuff. And not to take anything away from Texas, they'll be ready. They're going to be fine. Sark is as good as they are. But both of these teams on the offensive side do an unbelievable job. You talked about moving around McMillan. Sark's pretty good at finding that matchup he likes.
A lot of teach tape out of this game.
Oh, man.
With a month to prepare.
In the motion, in the shifts, and being that safety or that nickel, where now all of a sudden it's like, wait, well, how did he get – oh, that's mine. That's a bad feeling to have, and both secondaries are going to be tested to the max in this game. That's where the fun stuff. I think that's what the fans want to see. You get a high-scoring game after watching what should be a low-scoring game. It has all the makings in that building where we've seen some crazy things happen. It's going to be really, really special.
Wonder what kind of odds you can get in Vegas on Texas scoring a touchdown on the opening drive, because that's Sark's.
Two straight games.
I mean, that's
2 straight.
That's what he does so well. The other thing I think that has been hush-hush, whispered, I think you're going to see a little, not that Michael Penix wasn't terrific in the Pac-12 championship game, but I think you're going to see a little bit more early season. I think the time off probably did him a lot of good.
No doubt.
A lot of good. Same with J.J. McCarthy here. But because of that, I think it really helps Washington. I think it's one of the reasons that Washington, 9 straight games that they've won by no more than 10 points. Their biggest margin of victory was that SC game
10
that you mentioned, and everything else has been single digits.
And what's really interesting is I think the quarterback that's been talked about the least of the 4 teams is probably the best NFL prospect.
And he's also the best
Ewers.
fourth quarter quarterback in college football this year.
In 20 years.
Yeah.
If you look at the numbers,
Wow.
nobody has been better completion percentage-wise than Quinn Ewers in the fourth quarter of games in 20 years. And I think the interesting part for Texas, Rece, is they're going to have that opening script, and they're going to have those first 15 plays. They have been hitting lulls after that script, and they figure it out and recalibrate in the fourth quarter. But all the DCs who play Texas this year are like, we just got to survive these first 2-3 possessions. And then all of a sudden we get into the game a little bit. And that will be interesting for Washington if they do get waylaid a little bit early. Can they recalibrate and come back defensively on there? Now, Washington got 2 safeties back late in the season, which made a huge difference in that Oregon game.
They were tremendous against Oregon.
Huge difference in that Oregon game.
And I mentioned Ewers being the least talked about quarterback. I think Washington's defense is the least talked about unit of the 4 games. And you look at what they did against Oregon. I mean, that was so impressive what they did. I mean, again, the momentum swings. You mentioned Sark with the opening drives. Like, just withstand thing. Like, you don't have success early. Just be able to withstand. If they do get down there, hold them to a field goal and not a touchdown. Those are the little things that Washington's defense during this gauntlet of a schedule have just been able to hang around and do. And it's so impressive. And I think the world of all these coaches' staff, but Washington, what they've done late in the season when nobody counted them to do it has been tremendous.
They've missed a bunch of tackles though, and they give up a lot of yards after contact. And with that Texas offensive line, I think it's problematic. They're going to have to not be out of position so that they don't get gashed. And then when they are in position, as simplistic as it sounds, and they haven't always been great at it, better in the Oregon game for sure, but they got to get guys on the ground because it's the yards after that from guys like Worthy, Mitchell, Keelan Robinson, Sanders. All those guys can kill you if you don't get them down the first opportunity.
And the running back, the way he's done the running backs since Brooks got hurt. I mean, Baxter, he was the biggest recruit, I think, in that class.
And he started.
At the beginning of the year. You could tell at the Oklahoma game he didn't look right when he came in the game. But to be able to do that and still get your run game. Like every coach wants to run the football, but to lose a guy like Brooks and then to still be able to do and have success offensively, it's just another credit to Sark and that offensive staff.
Brooks might have been the first tailback taken in this draft if he had stayed healthy throughout the year. It's not a great tailback crop, but he had gone from a backup to start the year to at least tailback 1, 2, or 3 in the upcoming draft. Now, again, tailbacks don't get drafted like they used to, but you still need them. And, they still play a pretty important part on Sundays.
He was great. How patient he was in running those zones, man. Like, that you could tell he had something special that the other guys didn't, and Sark led on him.
Yeah, but Blue, along with Jaden Blue, has been really good too. Yep. So they've got I think they've got answers without Jonathan Brooks there for sure. So let's talk about Quinn Ewers again for just a little bit, because big hype, Ohio State, all the NIL deal, comes back, hurt a lot. We've heard 1,000 times. Have you guys heard he lost weight? Yeah, I mean, 1,000.
Cut his
have
hair.
you heard he cut his hair?
No Chick-fil-A.
He cut his hair. I mean, but the thing is, he's got that knack of on the biggest stage is when he plays his best. Before he got hurt last year against Alabama, he was terrific. He was brilliant in Tuscaloosa.
In that game.
Brilliant in Tuscaloosa earlier this season. I know it was a championship game, so I'm going to give him credit for Oklahoma State. Maybe not a juggernaut defense, but it's a championship game to give Texas a chance to get to the playoffs. And he throws for 450 or 452.
First half was one of the best first halves.
It was unbelievable.
Unreal.
And, so he has that knack. Some guys get tight. He seems to live for those moments, and a moment like he'll have.
Yeah, 17 of 20 on play action in that Big 12 title game, which is just insane. And that's one thing for our listeners and viewers to watch is Sark's play action is like a thing of beauty. You have no idea when the ball is snapped if they're going to run or pass. Quinn does a really deft job hiding it in there, and then you have two receivers who can go over the top, and that creates all the underneath stuff for one of the tailbacks or Sanders to slide across the middle. So it's really a beautifully designed, for like the football nerds, it's beautifully designed. And I give Quinn Ewers a ton of credit. Like, he was mediocre at times last year. He was sloppy with his mechanics. He looked loose.
I go back to that.
He was not a great decision maker. And I had an opposing DC tell me that the touchdown he threw against Alabama, we were all standing right there, to Worthy on a 44-yard ball. He said that was one of the best throws I've ever seen a quarterback make in all my years coordinating. So there are some of those wow moments, those things that like Quinn Ewers can do. The notion in Ewers' camp is that he will crush his pro day because he just throws such a pretty ball.
Jeff George-esque.
Yes.
Yeah. But give him a lot of credit.
Absolutely.
He became the face of NIL reluctantly in a lot of ways. He has the early entry from high school to Ohio State, leaves there, and he has lived up to what he's supposed to be, which really is a 50-50 proposition for elite quarterbacks.
It's got to be a tough day for Ohio State fans Monday, too. Watching Michigan have to play and then watching Quinn Ewers. And thinking if we had Quinn Ewers, we'd be playing today.
Sure.
Yeah. Hopefully they get away.
I don't know. Did they ever really expect to keep him, though, in some ways? It almost felt like when he went there that they were like, okay, this will be nice, but he's probably not staying. I don't know why I felt that way, but
I would think they did, knowing what the quarterback situation is currently.
Yeah, well,
he's right in the middle of those guys.
They were close on Malik Murphy. if Quinn didn't go, and then he reclasses and goes. And
that's right, he reclassified.
I'll say this: it was a weird experience for both sides when you look back at Ewers and Iowa State. He decides in July he has to finish some high school classes to graduate early, get eligible. Doesn't really arrive there until a couple weeks into camp.
Yeah.
Gets COVID a couple days later. So basically misses camp. They're focused on Oregon, who I believe they played in week 2 that year. Yeah. So he shows up and nobody cares about the 4th string. He's not going to win games.
Yeah.
So again, it's COVID times where classes, things aren't traditional. He doesn't know anybody. He doesn't have a class he came in with. He didn't do all that. So it was a situation that was very difficult, and it was almost set up not to work in those ways. And and that C.J. Stroud kid ended up okay.
Yeah.
So he looked at it. He looked ahead and went, "Well, I'm not gonna play next year." And it'll be really interesting after this set of games, because from the time I started covering Quinn Ewers, which was when he left high school early for that deal, his camp had been he is a 3 and done. We're going early to go, and we're chasing it. And that has completely changed, and the tune has completely changed. And I'm not guaranteeing he's going to come back, but that's certainly the strong lean, as we've reported on Game Day, that's the likely situation. Malik Murphy doesn't leave if he thinks Quinn Ewers is going. So, there's a lot of glaring signs. Now, look, if he goes out and has 2 more games at Oklahoma State and all of a sudden is in the top 7 conversation, that changes. But that seems unlikely. There's a cutoff for quarterbacks at 25 starts. And if you go back, and Marissa Dowling, our ace researcher, could go do this, the quarterbacks who have less than 25 starts who went early, the hit rate on them really working in the NFL is very low. So development, I think, in this era where guys are leaving and coming and going is one of the things that gets lost.
That's what we talked about with Carson Beck.
Yes.
About why it's a smart move for him to come back to Georgia.
Yeah. Now, in McCarthy's the other interesting one, too, because all of a sudden your quarterback crop next year will not be as deep as this year. But if it becomes Beck, McCarthy, and Ewers, I expect McCarthy to go. Right?
You do?
I do. Yeah. Look, he's 25-1 as a starter. He's going to lose all 5 of his offensive linemen. He's going to lose both his receivers. Now, I'll say this about Michigan for next year, because I think it's 17 starters expected, something like that. The dudes they have coming back are real dudes. The 2 defensive tackles, Graham, it's Kenneth Grant
Jenkins,
is the other. Yeah. Jenkins is gone, but those two young defensive tackles are elite.
Oh, they're young up there for sure.
Yes. Colson Loveland, like we talked about earlier, is elite. There are the young players in the program who have flashed are really Will Johnson. Right, high-end guy. So there are 4 or 5 guys where you're man, those guys could all be first-round picks, just the way they profile physically right now. So, but there's just going to be a lot of unknowns. And now look, they've done well with the portal on the O-line. Certainly, who wouldn't want to go play O-line at Michigan? You have back-to-back. Sharon Moore's the best offensive line coach in the country right now, and they've had back-to-back Joe Moore Award winners. Followed by a really good offense. But I think when you're making a business decision, you don't have an established receiver. You don't know who's going to start in front of you on the offensive line. That makes it very difficult, and you don't know who your coach is going to be.
I was about to say, you don't know who the head coach is going to be. That's a motivating factor.
I'm sure we're talking about that.
Well, you can't
if it happens.
You can't roll the dice on that, because right now he's probably got a chance to work his way in the first round, right?
I would think so. Yeah, I would think so. I don't think it's.
Have you seen the quarterbacks playing on Sundays?
Yeah. No, exactly.
Yeah.
There's 8 or 9 who need one, right? Yeah. He is physically slight, and that comes once you get away from all the great play, and he certainly had plenty of good play. The height, weight, speed stuff still matters, and there are certain general managers who won't draft a quarterback that don't fit a certain physical archetype, and that's just the way the NFL's worked. Right, wrong, or indifferent.
No doubt.
They're just. He is never going to. But he's never going to. It's like the 5'10" point guard is never going to be 6'2". He is never going to just be some rocked up guy. So I think Rece, to reflect back a little bit on the Harbaugh thing, it's a really interesting moment for Michigan as a program right now. They've clearly gone all in on this season, and they've gone all in on Jim Harbaugh. And the moment they lose, it's going to be unbelievably compelling. Other than Florida State right now, I think the biggest story in the sport is the moment Michigan loses, going forward here for the next month, what happens and how does it all evolve? We're going to have 7 or 8 NFL jobs open. Jim Harbaugh, if he left for the NFL, opening day next year would have the highest winning percentage of any active NFL coach. He's clearly established. He's clearly there. And if he comes back, he's going to face a lengthy suspension next year. Now, nobody can tell you because it's NCAA and they make it up as they go along. Will it be 3 games? Will it be 5 games? Will it be 7? Well, no, they do, actually.
I'll second it.
I've lived it, right? Yeah. But there's they have certainly dedicated a lot of time, resources, communication with the Big Ten to this case. It does not appear like the college basketball scandal, for example, a case they're ready to just like bury and move on. Just if you look at the motivations, you look at how they've handled it publicly, releasing the statement about the cheeseburger, like their actions indicate they're particularly locked in on this. So. And it'll be very interesting theater how this evolves. And look, he could hold the trophy up and walk out the grand hero. And that's all. It's all on the table here. I think the best thing about this playoff is all 4. There's a compelling case.
I was just going to ask.
All 4 can win
for the first time in a long time.
He said the moment Michigan loses, and I was thinking the whole time you said it, they might not. They might not.
And that's very real. And look, you've been on the Michigan bandwagon. You had them number 1 in your preseason poll, as Jim's pointed out to you. They are a very good team. And I don't know, like percentage-wise, if we had to like chop it up, who I give but I don't think anybody's like over 50% chance they're going to win this thing. And I don't think anybody's under 15% in how you divide it all. But it's I'm looking forward. We've been due these last 2 playoffs, quite frankly.
Yeah, it's Well, we had the great semifinal last year. The one thing I'll say about this, a lot of years, there is a clear team, maybe 2, but usually a clear team that's the best team. Doesn't mean they're going to win it, because that's where you draw that distinction of it's not always the best team, it's the team that plays the best on that stage in that moment. This year feels different to me because I think I would not be stunned if any of the 4 win the national championship in a week or so in Houston. I think all 4 can win it.
I also think back to last year, and you mentioned that game, talking about the Peach Bowl. Ohio State played their best game of the season last year in that game.
They were great.
And lost.
Yeah.
Like that, you talk about the luck and the opportunities and mistakes. Like that's what's crazy about this whole thing. And good luck.
Yeah.
Sometimes, though, you know exactly what's going to happen. And when you know more often than your colleagues, you get steak. You know what? Speaking of,
well, we got to pick these games.
Yeah, I know. Speaking of not finishing strong.
Oh, I wasn't going to bring that.
No,
one
I didn't. I was right there, man. I closed, and then I went. A game we just watched right before we recorded this podcast. Then I went Kentucky down the stretch, and I gave it right back to you with a 3-7 finish. Kentucky played great. They just came up a little short against Clemson. So if we're going to pick these games, let's do them in ranking and chronological order for New Year's Day. The first semifinal will be Alabama and Michigan from the Rose Bowl. Pete, you go first. Who's going to win, Alabama or Michigan?
I'm going to take the Crimson Tide, and I'm going to take them 13-10.
Wow. Wow. Okay.
I'm going to take Alabama. I will go.
What's the line, by the way? Because I want
Michigan
favored by 1.5, I think.
All right. 1.5 too. Right.
If it was like 3.5, I would have bumped it up.
I'll go Alabama 27-17.
Okay.
Conventional score.
Yeah. I'm going to go Alabama 23-20. Win it with a Will Reichard field goal late.
Alabama never makes field goals to win games.
But now they've got the all-time leading scorer in the history of the sport, right?
Yeah. I would think Nick's palms would still be sweating a little bit.
There's no question. It would be sweating a lot for sure. So you hinted at it earlier in the Sugar Bowl later on.
I'm taking
Texas
both
and Washington.
underdogs. I'm taking Bama and I'm taking Washington.
Is Alabama really ever an underdog? They were in the SEC championship game.
Yeah. And I do. I like the matchup. You mentioned Penix. I think the time off is huge for him. I love both these staffs and what they've done. But I do believe Washington has being able to play the underdog on this stage again. I think is a real thing, and they know what they have to do to be successful. They know what they are, and I'm interested to see the crowd there. I would imagine point. Texas is going to –
yeah.
It's going to be huge for an Orange.
70-30?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Even better. Even better. I'm going to go Washington 34-30.
I'm I'm going to go Washington 41-37. I think this thing gets a little loose. I think it gets a shootout. And part of my pick comes down to trusting Kalen DeBoer figuring out how to win games. Washington has had to figure out how to win games pretty much every week since the middle of the season. And you go back to his NAIA roots, Kalen DeBoer has been elite at figuring out how to win games. Top 5 play of the season is that 4th and 1 against Washington State, right? Like there is a creativity, there is a vision, there is a depth there. Look, I love what Sark has done this year. I think the world of Ewers as a player and a prospect. I think that it'll be a little bit of a wild, goofy game, but I am going to take the Huskies to figure it out at the end.
Okay. I agree with everything you guys have said, except your winners. I'm taking Texas. I think that those two guys in the interior of the defensive front will disrupt Washington enough on offense to give the Longhorns an extra possession or two to make plays. I'm not going to go quite as high scoring as you guys did.
That's smart.
I'm going to say that Texas wins it 34-31.
Okay.
So I've got two. Herb Street would be happy with that. I think we'd have two semifinal games decided
but he's
by
got
a
the
field
low-scoring
goal.
game.
He's got the low-scoring game. That's right. He'll like
He's
that.
tough.
That's right. He'll be looking at the
Make
grass, talking about the grass, giving a few hosannas about the blade of Bermuda or whatever. So,
if your outcome is correct, who do you make the favorite?
Texas. You?
That'll be 3 straight games. Alabama's an underdog.
Yeah.
That's some stuff we haven't seen in a long, long time.
I mean,
I honestly think you can make it a pick 'em.
Yeah.
I really do.
yeah.
They went there and won. I get it.
I
Alabama's
think you
a
have to
different
start
team.
him as the favorite. I agree with Rece.
Yeah, the Alabama deal with the betting world is a different animal. That's why I'm still shocked they're an underdog in this game.
Yeah.
It almost makes you think that Michigan's number one. They're undefeated. As you mentioned, we've all had great respect for them, regardless of where I had them ranked in the preseason, because I've moved them around. They haven't been number one wire to wire. But it almost makes you think that Vegas knows a little something, and that maybe everybody got a little too enamored over that Georgia win. Alabama's good. Don't misunderstand. They're good, and they have improved steadily all the way, and Milroe is a ridiculous difference maker. So is Dallas Turner. I think you're right. He is the best player in this game. But they haven't always been that. And
look at the Auburn game.
Michigan, yeah.
Exactly.
The Auburn game,
the Haunted Mansion game.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that I do, because I grew up there and I went to school there. You can just, people say it because it is. The difference is, here's the difference. And my wife, who is an Auburn alum, is probably going to get mad at me when I say this, but I'm going to say it. For them, when they play Alabama, it's a crusade of religious significance. For Alabama, it's avoiding the catastrophe of having to deal with hearing about having lost. And there is a difference in the way it's approached. Look at the way Auburn played the week before against New Mexico State. So I don't think it's fair to dismiss the game out of hand. They made a lot of mistakes. They had a chance to put the game away early. They didn't. So you don't dismiss it out of hand. But it's sort of like, in some ways, even though Washington had played a lot of close games, Washington State, at least for that Saturday, was on a crusade. They, end of the Pac-12, their last chance against them as conference rivals, wanted to make their mark, ruin their season, whole thing, and you wind up with a 3-point game. So some of those, I'm a little, especially late in the year, I'm a little more forgiving of some of those under those circumstances.
Don't disagree.
Very fair.
Can't wait till that game's in Auburn again, and I could pick Alabama, and you're just going to shake my head. Why are you doing that?
Well, it'll be a different deal. You'll be a little more established with the people.
Well, Georgia's other big struggle this season was at Auburn.
Yeah.
And that was their until the end. That was really their.
And we're digressing a little, I know, but Georgia gave up 200 yards on the ground to Auburn, and so did Alabama in that place.
Yeah.
That's not an everyday occurrence against either of them. And Auburn, back to this game, that's one thing that Michigan may do slightly, but they're not going to be as apt to have the linebackers in the wrong caps for Alabama and stuff. So those are the kinds of running games that have given Alabama more fits, I think, than this type. But Not the same type of defense.
All right. So for our viewers and for our listeners, where should we eat steak in Houston? That's really the question from here, right?
Yeah. What is it?
I mean, they got to have some good meat in Houston.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wait, what was the name of the place that you and I went? We went
It was
there.
really good.
The Final
really,
Four?
really good.
Yeah, it was
really
good.
expensive because he owed me. So.
Yeah, I owed him. It was
He made me
very
make the reservation.
expensive.
I was like,
So
well,
good, you don't remember the name.
we're not going
No,
there.
it was excellent. What was it? I don't. I'm embarrassed.
Yeah.
I ate there twice. It was so good.
It
I
was
ate
really
there
good.
twice while I
Yeah.
was there for the Final Four.
We'll figure it out.
So we'll do it.
All right.
We'll eat there at least once.
Sounds
when we're
good.
there
Fair.
for the championship game. I hope that some of you are watching on YouTube, and I don't know how much of the background we've got here, but behind the camera position over there, as I wax a little bit about this great venue, which was, the first bowl game back when they were exhibitions designed to just draw tourists. This stadium has had the World Cup. They've had U2. They've had the Olympics.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
5 Super Bowls?
Yeah, Super
Wasn't,
Bowls. I think
Randy
Michael Jackson
Chastain
played here. Randy Chastain was here. There was a poor throw from a quarterback with Stanford Steve, or else he would have a big catch there. Desmond Howard played here after his Heisman Trophy winning season. Did he play here twice? I know he played after the Heisman Trophy winning season.
He played Washington twice.
Didn't go the way he wanted it to, I think. Because Washington won the national championship, or a share of it, after that year in 1991.
Yep.
So,
Plenty of history. That's what makes it great.
Awesome.
makes it great. It's a great place.
Thank
Look at that.
Whoever made this happen.
Thank you, guys. This is awesome.
Yeah. We really appreciate it, whoever did this.
And
I
so,
hope the table withstands it.
Yeah. We didn't even have to buy it for Steve. That's a.
you guys are going to have extra steak because as we're recording this, and I assume we're still rolling, I've got to go do halftime. So don't let this
We'll give it to Steve.
beautiful cut of meat go to waste. This is delicious.
It's really good.
Where we got this?
Taylor.
Fleming's?
Fleming's. Awesome.
Love Fleming's.
Yeah.
Guys, you can continue the chat. Talkative and undisciplined, that's a staple of this podcast. And now I've got to go do a pregame show for Missouri and Ohio State after Memphis and Iowa State. I wish Memphis and Iowa State were going into overtime so that I could continue.
I don't think that's going to happen.
Well,
Thank you.
2:37 left. Enjoy the steak.
Undisciplined would really be if they brought out all the sides. That's when the lack of discipline really shows.
Okay. I'm eating this last piece of meat because this is likely to be my dinner.